Well, let me tell ya, my life was pretty average. I'm John Smith, a graphic designer from Seattle. I liked the freelance gig, gave me time for the family, and my woodworking hobby. Things were predictable, comfortable. Then, one Monday morning, BM, this letter shows up from some California lawyers. Turns out, my Aunt Mildred, who I hadn't talked to in ages, left me everything. I was floored. Aunt Mildred was always kind of distant, sent Christmas cards and little gifts when I was a kid, but we weren't close. Still, she held a special place in my heart. The letter said she left me 3 houses in a nice, quiet suburb down in Southern California. She'd bought them years ago, planning to rent them out for retirement. Sounds like she took good care of them until she got sick later on. Thinking about her being alone at the end made me sad, but I was also incredibly grateful. After checking everything with the lawyers, I hopped on a plane to California to sort things out. The neighborhood was picture perfect. Leafy streets, manicured lawns, the whole 9 yards. It looked like a great place to raise a family. The houses were modest but solid. 2 were 1-story with cute little porches. The third was a bigger 2-story with a backyard that needed some work. They had potential, though. I figured I could fix them up, rent them out, and give my own family a little extra security. A few days later, I started switching over the utilities and getting inspections. That's when the trouble started. I got a letter at one of the houses from the HOA, demanding $2,000 in overdue fees and late charges. I was confused. I didn't even know there was an HOA. I called the lawyers back, and they assured me the houses weren't part of any HOA. The original deeds backed them up, so I figured it was just a mistake and ignored it. Big mistake. The HOA wasn't messing around. A week later, another letter, way more aggressive this time. They slapped a lien on one of the houses for the unpaid dues. Panic set in. I read that letter over and over. How could they put a lien on a house that wasn't even in their HOA? I went to the next HOA meeting, determined to get some answers. It was in this little clubhouse. As soon as I walked in, the board members stared me down. The HOA president, this guy named Charles, basically dismissed me the second I introduced myself and explained the situation. He just sat back and said, "Tough luck, Smith. These properties are in our HOA. If your aunt didn't pay, you gotta pay now." I tried to stay calm. Explaining the deed said the houses weren't part of the HOA when my aunt bought them. Charles just waved his hand, saying they added a clause later that brought the houses into the HOA. He basically told me to talk to a lawyer and shut me down. Frustrated but not giving up, I went straight home and called a real estate lawyer, this smart lady named Nancy Harper. She looked everything over and confirmed what I suspected. That retroactive clause was fishy, especially since no one mentioned it when the houses were transferred to me. Nancy told me to file a dispute, saying we had a strong case. I figured I'd start the renovations while the legal stuff played out. Just when I thought things were calming down, another letter shows up. Another lien, on the second house, same bogus reasons. Now I was just mad. It was obvious they were trying to bully me, regardless of the law. I started digging into the HOA's history. Turns out Charles had been president for over a decade and had a reputation for being a real hardliner. People whispered about unfair fines and shady dealings, but nobody wanted to rock the boat. I realized I wasn't just fighting for my houses, I was fighting for the whole neighborhood. Weeks turned into a blur of phone calls with Nancy, letters to the HOA, and the headaches of managing those 3 houses. It was stressful, but I couldn't give up. My aunt trusted me with these houses, and I wasn't going to let some power-tripping HOA steal them. Then wham! Another lien, this time on the 2-story house. They claimed unpaid legal fees for their efforts to force me to comply. The nerve! It was like they wanted me to give up. But I dug in my heels. This wasn't just about the houses anymore. It was about standing up to corruption. The morning was chilly as I drove to the second house. It was a cute little 1-story at the end of a cul-de-sac, and I was excited about fixing it up. But when I got to the mailbox, there it was, another HOA letter. My heart sank. Another lien, same BS reasons. Lawn maintenance, paint color, some debris they said was on the property. It was ridiculous. The house had been empty for years. Any junk there wasn't mine. I was so angry. I sat in my car, staring at that letter, wondering how the HOA could get away with this. The houses weren't even part of their HOA. I decided I wasn't waiting around anymore. I was going to fight back. That night, I called Nancy. She listened as I vented about the new lien. "They're trying to wear you down, John," she said. "They're hoping you'll just give up and pay." But how can they do this? I asked, exasperated. These houses aren't even in the HOA. Nancy sighed. They're using loopholes, John. That annexation clause they keep citing gives them just enough wiggle room to make your life hell. We'll fight the liens in court, but these cases take time. And that's what they're counting on. They figure you'll just pay to avoid the hassle. Nancy told me she'd file a formal dispute and demand proof the liens were legit. They'd have to show their financial records, meeting minutes, and proof my aunt's houses were actually part of the HOA. The next day, I hit the county records office. I spent hours digging through old files, trying to piece together the HOA's history. I found out that annexation clause was added almost 20 years ago, long after my aunt bought her houses. And get this, there was no record of her ever agreeing to it. That was huge. Without her consent, the HOA's claims were worthless. I also noticed something else. The HOA had slapped liens on a bunch of properties over the years, usually for vague violations like mine. Some of those houses ended up in foreclosure, and guess who got them? The HOA. It clicked. This wasn't about community rules. It was about stealing property. I started talking to other people in the neighborhood. Most were too scared of the HOA to talk, but this older couple, Richard and Helen Davis, agreed to meet. They lived there for decades and had their own HOA horror stories. Richard told me how the HOA fined them for leaving their trash cans out too long. The fines piled up, and the HOA threatened to sue. Helen chimed in, they're bullies, plain and simple. But fighting them is exhausting. Most people just pay to make them go away. I asked them about the foreclosed properties. Richard sighed, that's how they do it. They push people until they can't pay, then the HOA takes the house and sells it. It's wrong, but everyone's too scared to fight back. Armed with this new information, I put together a timeline of everything that happened. Every letter, every interaction with the HOA, all the evidence I found. I even wrote to the state attorney general, explaining I thought the HOA was committing fraud. Meanwhile, Nancy was working hard on the legal side. The HOA had 30 days to respond to our dispute, and just before the deadline, they sent a letter. It was a bunch of legal mumbo-jumbo, but they didn't include any of the documents Nancy asked for. They're bluffing, Nancy said. They don't have the proof. We'll use this to our advantage. Even with this good news, the stress was getting to me. The threat of foreclosure, the lawyer bills, it was a lot. I almost gave up, but I kept thinking about my aunt. She worked hard for those houses, and I wasn't going to let some crooked HOA take them. My determination grew stronger. I kept gathering evidence, talking to neighbors, and preparing for the legal fight. The HOA pushed me to my limit, but they also woke up something inside me. I wasn't just fighting for my houses, I was fighting for what was right. Then came another HOA letter, threatening more action if I didn't pay. But instead of feeling defeated, I felt empowered. I knew I was in the right, and I was ready to bring it. This whole HOA thing took over my life. Every day brought new challenges, and the letters kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last. My mailbox was a war zone. Every time I saw the HOA logo, my stomach clenched. But I wouldn't give up. The third letter, on a rainy Friday, was a real turning point. They slapped a lien on the biggest house, the 2-story one, claiming I owed them legal fees for their efforts to get me to comply. It was insane. They were billing me for fighting their bogus liens. The letter also said they'd start foreclosure if I didn't pay within 30 days. The nerve. These were my houses, legally mine, left to me by my aunt. And they were acting like they owned them. I called Nancy right away. She was furious. This is pure pressure, John. They're hoping you'll either cave or run out of money to fight them. But this is also their biggest mistake. Charging you for legal fees when their liens are already questionable? That's a stretch even for them. My determination came flooding back. Nancy suggested we file a formal discovery request, forcing the HOA to show every single document related to their claims, every lien, every supposed legal fee. She also said we should contact the local media. Publicity might make them back off. Later that week, I went to another HOA meeting. I wanted answers, face to face. I brought a recorder and a notepad, ready to document everything. I saw a few familiar faces in the room, neighbors I'd talked to. Some gave me encouraging nods, others avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable. The meeting started with the usual updates and announcements. When it was time for public comments, I raised my hand. Charles, the HOA president, gave me a nasty look. "Mr. Smith," he said, condescendingly, "I assume you have something to share?" I stood up, my voice firm. "I want to know why the HOA put 3 liens on my properties, claiming unpaid dues and violations that are completely false." These houses aren't even legally part of this HOA, and you know it." The room went silent. Everyone was staring at us. Charles leaned back, a smug look on his face. "As we've explained before, Mr. Smith, these properties are under our jurisdiction because of the annexation clause. You're welcome to review the documents with our legal team." I held up a folder with copies of the deeds, public records, and letters from Nancy. "I have reviewed the documents. The annexation clause wasn't in the original agreement when my aunt bought these houses. She never agreed to it, and neither have I. I demand proof of your claims." Charles's smug smile faltered. "This isn't the place for legal disputes, Mr. Smith. If you want to challenge the liens, take it up in court." My frustration boiled over. "I already have filed a dispute, and your lawyers haven't provided a single piece of evidence. Instead, you've doubled down with bogus charges and threats of foreclosure. This isn't enforcement, it's harassment." The room buzzed with whispers. Some neighbors were nodding in agreement. Charles stayed calm on the outside, but I could see a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Your accusations are baseless, Mr. Smith. The HOA operates within its rights, and any further disruptions will result in your removal from this meeting." I knew I wasn't getting anywhere, so I sat down. But I'd made my point. After the meeting, a few neighbors came up to me, sharing their own HOA horror stories. One single mom, Patricia, told me they fined her for a broken mailbox she couldn't afford to fix. "They want us to be scared," she whispered. "But I'm glad someone's finally standing up to them." Encouraged by the support, I doubled down. I gathered more evidence, not just for my case, but to expose the HOA's pattern of abuse. I contacted local news stations and blogs, sharing my story and encouraging others to speak out. The media response was fast. A local journalist, Melissa Evans, contacted me, wanting to investigate HOA corruption. She visited my properties and interviewed me on camera. She seemed genuinely interested in getting to the truth. When I mentioned other residents with similar problems, she said she'd contact them too. Within days, the story exploded. The news report aired during prime time, featuring interviews with me, Patricia, and another resident who'd lost their house to foreclosure because of the HOA. The report made the HOA look like a bunch of power-hungry bullies. The backlash was immediate. Residents flooded the HOA with complaints. The board, so confident before, was suddenly under intense scrutiny. Charles, especially, looked rattled. His carefully crafted image as a community leader was falling apart. But the HOA wasn't done with me. A few days later, I got a letter from their lawyers accusing me of defamation and threatening to sue if I didn't retract my statements. I sent the letter to Nancy. "They're trying to scare you into silence," she said. "Don't let them. This means they're feeling the pressure." For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Things were turning around, and I wasn't alone in the fight. The HOA had underestimated me, and now they were facing a whole neighborhood demanding justice. I knew the fight wasn't over, but I was ready for what came next. This wasn't just about my houses anymore. It was about standing up to an abusive system and showing that even an ordinary person could make a difference. The next few weeks were all about strategy. My life was consumed by calls with Nancy, meetings with neighbors, and preparing for the court case that would decide the fate of my houses. The once quiet suburb had become a battleground, with residents lining up against the HOA board. Nancy moved fast. She filed a discovery request, forcing the HOA to turn over all their documentation about the liens, meeting minutes, financial records, proof that my houses were legally part of the HOA. She also filed a motion to contest the liens, arguing the HOA had no jurisdiction and hadn't disclosed that sneaky annexation clause to my aunt. "We're not just fighting the liens, John," Nancy explained. "We're challenging the entire basis of their claims. If we can prove the annexation was invalid, their whole case falls apart." I spent hours poring over documents Nancy got from public records. I found suspiciously vague meeting minutes and incomplete financial reports. One entry caught my eye: legal expenses for my properties, approved in a closed-door meeting without a vote from the residents. "This isn't just shady," I muttered. "It's illegal." The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. The HOA board, led by Charles, was operating in secret and playing fast and loose with the rules. The news reports about my case kept coming. Melissa Evans, the journalist, did a series of articles digging into the HOA's finances. She found inflated legal fees, questionable payments to contractors connected to board members, and evidence of kickbacks to Charles. My phone blew up with messages from residents thanking me for speaking out and sharing their own stories of HOA harassment. The problem was way bigger than just my 3 houses. One woman, Maria Garcia, told me through tears how the HOA fined her for a backyard swing set that wasn't aesthetically pleasing, and it eventually led to a lien in foreclosure. "These aren't just stories, John, they're evidence," Nancy said. "If we can show a pattern of abuse, it'll make our case even stronger." Nancy and I organized a meeting for residents who wanted to testify or give written statements about their experiences with the HOA. We had a huge turnout. Almost 24 people crammed into my living room, everyone with documents, photos, and letters detailing their grievances. The stories ranged from petty fines for minor infractions to outright financial exploitation. We decided to form a coalition to hold the HOA accountable. We called ourselves the Fair Housing Alliance and chose me as our spokesperson. I felt the pressure, but I was also energized by the group's collective strength. The HOA fought back. After our coalition formed, residents started getting letters warning them not to participate in my legal case. The letters were full of legal jargon and vague threats about penalties and lawsuits. "These are scare tactics," Nancy assured everyone at our next meeting. "They have no legal basis, but the HOA is hoping to intimidate you into silence." I wasn't intimidated, but I worried about my neighbors. Many were older or didn't have a lot of money, making them easy targets for the HOA's bullying. I encouraged them to stay strong, even offering to cover their legal fees if they testified. As the HOA ramped up their efforts, Charles started acting even weirder. At the next HOA meeting, he went on a rant about disruptive elements undermining the community, staring right at me the whole time. The tension in the room was thick, but I didn't back down. I calmly raised my concerns about the liens and the annexation, pointing out the lack of evidence from the HOA. Charles's response? He called security and had me thrown out. That only made the other residents angrier. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. Nancy and I walked into the courthouse, armed with a rock-solid case. Nancy had built a comprehensive argument challenging the liens, backed up by resident testimony, public records, and legal precedent. The courtroom was packed. Many of my neighbors came to support me. The HOA's legal team, led by this fancy lawyer, focused on the annexation clause, arguing it gave them jurisdiction over my houses. But their case fell apart under Nancy's questioning. When she asked for proof that my aunt agreed to the annexation, the HOA lawyer admitted they didn't have any. Then Nancy presented our evidence, the doctored financial records, the resident testimonies. She argued the HOA was engaging in a pattern of abuse, forcing homeowners into compliance or foreclosure. The judge was clearly unimpressed with the HOA's lack of transparency. He grilled their lawyer about the legality of the annexation. When the lawyer admitted the annexation hadn't been formally approved by a resident vote, the judge was furious. "This appears to be a gross overreach of authority," he said. "The lack of documentation and due process is deeply concerning." After hours of testimony and arguments, the judge ruled in my favor. He invalidated all 3 liens and said the annexation wasn't enforceable. The courtroom erupted in applause. I felt a wave of relief, but it didn't end there. The judge ordered the HOA to pay my legal fees and damages, and he suggested the state attorney general investigate their practices. The ruling set a precedent, encouraging other residents to pursue their own cases against the HOA. As I left the courthouse, my neighbors surrounded me, congratulating me and thanking me. For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful, not just for myself, but for the whole neighborhood. That night, sitting on the porch of one of my houses, I thought about everything that had happened. The fight had been brutal, but it taught me the power of standing up for what's right. I went from being an outsider to a community leader, all because I wanted to honor my aunt's legacy. This victory wasn't just mine, it belonged to everyone who joined the fight. We stood together against corruption and rebuilt our neighborhood on trust and accountability. The days after the court victory were a whirlwind. My fight had become a rallying cry for residents fed up with the HOA's bullying. The Fair Housing Alliance, which started as a small group, was now a full-blown movement. I got calls and emails from neighbors, people in other communities, even folks from other states who'd seen the news reports. I was exhausted, but I knew we had to keep the momentum going. I scheduled a coalition meeting at one of my houses, the one that got the first lien. It felt symbolic. The living room was crowded with people eager to plan our next steps. Nancy came to advise us. She congratulated us and explained how we could use the court ruling to make bigger changes. "This isn't just about the liens," she said. "The judge's ruling exposed serious problems within the HOA, lack of transparency, abuse of power, financial mismanagement. You have a chance to push for reforms that will benefit everyone." We talked about our priorities: holding the HOA accountable for what they'd done, making sure they operated transparently in the future, and preventing future abuses. Some residents wanted to recall the current board, others wanted an independent audit of the HOA's finances. I suggested we do both: legal action for past wrongs and grassroots efforts to change the HOA from the inside. As we worked on our plans, the media kept digging. Melissa Evans released a new report detailing the HOA's financial shenanigans: inflated budgets, questionable payments to contractors connected to board members, and kickbacks to Charles. The report caused an uproar. Residents who'd been too scared to speak out before started coming forward. One homeowner told us how the HOA fined her for painting her front door the wrong shade of blue, and it turned out Charles's cousin owned the company that sold the approved paint. Another resident said they were fined for a cracked driveway, but the HOA wouldn't explain how they calculated the fine. It was clear the HOA was a tool for Charles and his cronies to line their pockets at the residents' expense. With all the support, we launched a campaign to recall the HOA board. Getting enough signatures wasn't easy. Many residents were still scared of the HOA. But we went door to door, explaining the situation and asking our neighbors to join us. The response was amazing. Most people were ready for change. We got enough signatures in a matter of weeks, forcing the board to schedule a recall election. Election night was tense. We gathered in the clubhouse. Charles and the other board members sat up front, looking defiant and uneasy. I sat with the coalition, feeling nervous but excited. As the votes were counted, the tension built. When they announced the results, the room erupted in cheers. We'd won. The recall passed by a landslide. Charles stormed out, furious, but I felt nothing but relief. The community had spoken. With the old board gone, we set up an interim leadership team until a formal election could be held. I didn't run for the board. I felt my strengths were in advocacy, not governance. I focused on helping the new board implement reforms. The new leaders prioritized transparency and community involvement. They hired an independent auditor to review the HOA's finances, which uncovered even more shady dealings. They revised the bylaws, getting rid of that annexation clause and adding safeguards against future abuse. The changes made me proud. I'd fought not just for my houses, but for the heart of the neighborhood my aunt loved. The fight had been hard, but it brought us together. Months later, I was at the two-story house, watching the contractors put the finishing touches on the renovations. This house, once a source of so much stress, now felt like a symbol of our resilience. I decided to rent it to Maria Garcia, the single mom whose story helped fuel our movement. Seeing her kids playing in the yard filled me with joy. My other properties were doing well, too. They were home to families who appreciated the neighborhood's newfound sense of unity and fairness. I went back to my life in Seattle, but I visited often, feeling a deep connection to the community I helped rebuild. Looking back, I felt a mix of emotions. The fight against the HOA tested my patience and my faith in justice, but it also showed me the power of standing up for what's right. I went from an ordinary guy to a community leader, driven by the desire to honor my aunt's legacy. The victory wasn't just mine, it belonged to everyone who joined the fight. We took on a corrupt system and won. It proved that even against overwhelming odds, persistence and courage can prevail. As the sun set over the quiet suburban street, I felt at peace. The fight was over, but the lessons I learned would stay with me forever.